Some opening shot thoughts. The Trump administration's aggressive immigration enforcement tactics are being met with big pushback in federal court. And there have been so many rulings just in the last couple of days, but one of them struck right at the heart of the First Amendment. Federal Judge Sarah Ellis put a temporary restraining order on ICE and other federal agents for their use of force against journalists, protesters like the ones seen here, and other groups who say their rights are being infringed upon by the federal government. The judge also ordered that all federal agents have to have visible identification. That's something that they've obscured because what they say is heightened security risk. Now today, plaintiffs' attorneys celebrated this ruling that they say protects citizens' sacred rights.
The people we represent who filed this lawsuit were exercising cherished First Amendment rights. They were holding signs, protesting, exercising constitutional First Amendment rights to protest what the government was doing. They were doing it peacefully, and they were doing it in a way that did not merit any violence. And they were subjected to tear gas, they were subjected to physical violence, they were shot at, less than lethal weapons were used against them, all for doing nothing but protesting what ICE was doing and what the federal officials were doing in our city.
Temporary restraining order against the president's deployment of the National Guard, and then the ruling against warrantless ICE arrests and a handful of prosecutions against protesters that have now been dropped. And it's clear the federal government has a credibility problem. They have flamboyantly and provocatively attempted to use video, photos, and social media to portray a certain narrative to the public about lawlessness, supposedly to set the stage for a bigger federal intervention. It makes for good social media and cable news content, but one by one, their claims have consistently fallen apart in court, where they need hard evidence to back up their case. It echoes their strategy to declare the 2020 election stolen. Lots of assertions made in the court of public opinion, but they fall apart when they need to defend them in court. Today's rulings get at the heart of federal power and the rights of all American citizens, and we're going to dig into all of this in just a second. Tonight, a federal judge blocks the deployment of National Guard troops in Chicago. We break down what the ruling means. Another federal judge rules that ICE unlawfully used force against journalists and protesters. And the next great Chicago movie, a local comedy troupe on the Chicago political screenplay they want to see on the big screen. Welcome to the Chicago Report. I'm Paris Schutz. All eyes on the Dirksen Federal Building today as multiple court rulings strike at the heart of President Trump's escalated deportation and federal law enforcement efforts in Chicago. Judge April Perry granted a temporary restraining order against the deployment of the National Guard, saying it clearly violates the 10th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. Attorneys for the state declare it a victory for states' rights.
This is an important decision, not just for the state of Illinois, but for the entire country. The question of state sovereignty was addressed in this decision. The question of whether or not the President of the United States should have unfettered authority to militarize our cities was answered today.
And joining us now via Zoom is Carolyn Shapiro, law professor and director of the Center for the Supreme Court at IIT Kent College of Law, and Robert Pape, the director of the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Great to talk to both of you again. And just to note, the dark behind me, it's not because we're trying to be like the old Charlie Rose show. We're having an issue with our backboard here, but we're trying to fix that. Anyway, again, this TRO, Carolyn Shapiro, it's enacted for 14 days. The National Guard cannot deploy. Very stark oral comments from Judge Perry, and we await the full ruling tomorrow. Your reaction?
Well, I agree with what you said at the top, that the government has made a lot of very provocative statements. The president in particular has made a lot of statements about what's going on in Chicago. But when they came into court, they had to actually back those up with evidence, and by and large they were not able to do so. And in fact, several of the incidents that they relied on in their filing to claim that there's a danger of rebellion here, or that the president cannot execute the law here, with ordinary forces are exactly those very claims that were, or very charges that were dismissed today in other courtrooms by the government itself. So, and I think this is incredibly important. We have a long and important tradition in this country of separating the military from law enforcement. We do have statutes that allow for the calling out of the National Guard under certain limited circumstances, but those are limited circumstances. The government basically argued that those circumstances whenever the president says they exist, the courts have to just defer to it. And I don't think that is a plausible reading of the statutes or of the Constitution.
And I want to read some of her comments, because her comments really took issue with the credibility of the Department of Homeland Security. She says, quote, "Not even Alexander Hamilton could have envisioned one state's militia to be used against another state's residents because the president wants to punish those with views other than his own." Robert Pape, how does this play into your understanding of conflicts throughout history around the world when you've got one state's militia, so to speak, being sent to another state here to, quote unquote, police?
Well, I think the judge has really put her finger on some of the key issues here, besides simply the legal issues. She is calling out the credibility of the Department of Homeland Security and also the deployment of the Guard in terms of whether they're needed. And that's a question of whether we actually have a rebellion as opposed to a small protest that's gotten feisty and then the local police can handle it, as there's evidence they did in this case. But the second and bigger issue here, I would argue, is whether they're making matters worse. If they come, are they going to inflame the situation, have it go further out of control, so that in fact you end up in a snowball situation where you put in 200 or 300, then you have to put in 500, then 1,000, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, where the deployment itself is making matters worse. And I just want to point out, we've done a big study of the deployment of 250 DHS agents to Portland in July 2020, and there's substantial evidence that that deployment of the 250,000 escalated the protests from 100 or two to over 3,000 that got progressively more aggressive and more violent, and that happened over a period of weeks. So there is precedent here in the United States, not just around the world, for exactly what this judge is worried about.
And Carolyn Shapiro, to that point, Judge Perry basically said the Broadview facility has seen protests for 19 years that it's been in operation, but it only took a turn when Customs and Border Patrol announced increased enforcement. She said multiple times in her comments that she believes the evidence is clear that the increased enforcement has a lot to do with the escalating tensions, with some of the unrest that you see. But why do you think only 14 days for the TRO?
That's what the law allows. A temporary restraining order is designed to preserve the status quo before it was filed, and the status quo before it was filed is no National Guards being deployed. And the law says that it can be imposed for only 14 days. With the possibility of another 14-day extension, followed by the possibility of a preliminary injunction. A TRO is also not supposed to be appealable, although under some circumstances, courts do accept appeals, and I would expect that the government here will try to appeal it. But the temporary restraining order is exactly what it sounds like. It's temporary. And between now and October 23rd, and now the parties will have the opportunity to marshal more evidence to come back in front of the judge and make their case.
And it was striking that, again, Judge Perry brought up numerous times that the federal government was kind of scant on specifics and evidence, couldn't even answer what the deployment was going to be for, whether it was going to be limited to guarding federal facilities or going into neighborhoods and policing, and it wouldn't define the term rebellion. But Robert Pape, what about this situation we find ourselves now in, where this TRO is in effect? What if the federal government chooses not to take the National Guard troops out of their deployment?
Well, President Trump has some options, some legal options. He can go the next level and he can declare the Insurrection Act. He can invoke the Insurrection Act. Now, the Insurrection Act creates a very special set of authorities where this overrides the issue of the authority of the governor. So one of the issues in this case is whether or not who decides what's a rebellion in this situation. Is it the governor of Illinois or is it the president of the United States? Well, you can debate that, but if President Trump goes the next step and declares the Insurrection Act, this really puts all of the authority, or a huge amount of that authority, in his hands. And this is why that is such a major step. And it would also have major consequences, not just for Chicago, but other cities, and not just for what President Trump is doing, but what a Democratic president could do down the road. So this is really now starting to get to the serious part, which is President Trump really willing to go to the Insurrection Act? And I would suggest that many Republican governors are going to have a lot to push back on that, because after all, there could be a Democratic president who could use flimsy reasons to do exactly the same thing in their states.
Certainly could be a huge new precedent set if the country goes that direction. But again, if we go on the judge's comments here and the judge in Oregon, they consistently say that there's no credibility to the notion that there's a rebellion or insurrection, and the facts on the ground do not comport with the narrative that DHS has tried to make. Let's continue this discussion. We got to take a break, but we'll continue this right when we come back.